Welcome back to the Let's Talk Data podcast with me, Emma Crabtree, brought to you by Mimir Talent. Today I'm really excited to welcome Rob Daly. He's a lead AI specialist at Anamana and founder of Mimir, and he's got a truly fascinating background. Rob helps businesses across various industries implement machine learning and AI, which gives him a unique perspective.
Yeah, I think there's a movement towards prevention, which is a big one. So I guess trying to understand the factors that might go into illness in healthcare in different ways. And, trying to build models that are predictive and then giving us that kind of, I suppose, shot beforehand of maybe putting an intervention in place, changing the outcomes, getting involved in that. So that's definitely really huge. And I can definitely see the world of large language models, clinical assistants, those sorts of things only making that even more interesting.
He's someone who brings together neuroscience, data science, and real-world strategy, focusing on building technology that genuinely serves people. We'll be exploring what it really takes to build a data-driven culture, discussing the serious risks of disinformation in the age of AI, and emphasising why curiosity, communication, and critical thinking are now more vital than ever in the world of data.
It comes back to my view of, I'm a massive believer that these tools are for augmentation. There are things that ultimately AI and machines can do better, heavily repetitive tasks that, people may not want to do themselves anyway. Our prime targets for things like generative AI and agents and stuff like that. But, for a lot of jobs, I see it as almost like a digital assistant. It's there to augment your capability and make you smarter, ultimately, to work together. That's my optimistic look for what I hope will come.
Rob will also offer a candid look at the realities of contracting, the importance of purpose-led teams, and how to find clarity amid the chaos of AI's rapid evolution. Get ready for a conversation filled with honest insights and practical wisdom as we navigate data, ethics, and innovation. Enjoy! Rob, let's talk data.
Hi.
Hello. Do you know what? We first spoke in February of this year. Do you know that?
We did indeed. God, that feels like it's gone quick.
Yeah, I feel like I've known you forever. Do you feel like that about me?
I do. Well, we did speak a lot, didn't we?
We did.
Yeah, there's that.
Yeah, and we're finally here. So thank you, because since I spoke to you, I was like, you need to come on the podcast.
Oh, I feel very honoured to be on here. I'm a super fan after all.
So we've got a lot to talk about: decision intelligence, disinformation, data science, data literacy, data excellence. But I thought we'd start with, who is Rob Daly, to give the audience a bit of a background.
Yeah, no, I can do that. So yeah, I had a bit of a strange way, I guess, into data science a little bit. It's kind of probably a bit traditional, probably a bit non-traditional, but my kind of original background was in neuroscience. That's what I did my master's in. I've always been fascinated with the human body and in particular the human brain. So for me, it felt like a natural route to take. But I kind of started getting a little bit disenfranchised with the lab element of it. Not because I didn't like it, but I just couldn't see myself fitting in it. And I'd done a lot of kind of stats work, obviously part and parcel of being in the kind of biology side of things. And I enjoyed that. And there was a good timing of a lecture in the early part of my master's at King's by a guy called Richard Dobson, which was great because it was about how data was transforming the way that kind of biology and that industry was operating. And I kind of listened to that and I went, oh yeah, I want to do that. And I've always been interested in computers, thanks to my dad. He used to mess about with computers. So I kind of thought like, oh, haven't I thought of this before? But I changed my optional modules. He advised me to go and hassle someone for a thesis that was about kind of machine learning, that sort of stuff, to get hands-on experience. So I did that, which was great. Learned how to code, kind of learned the basic principles of machine learning, built some really interesting models. Off the back of it, we built a really cool model that was looking at predicting Alzheimer's disease, because that was a particular interest of mine. And it was about bringing different layers of data together in a different way that you would normally use in machine learning. And it was a little bit more effective. It wasn't world changing, sadly. But it was great. And I think for me, the thing that came out of that the most, I think that inspired me a lot, is one of the limitations of the study we did was, that when you take a blood sample from someone, it's kind of like a shot in time, it's static. And for me, I then got really interested in the digital world and digital health, and we're all wearing wearables. I've got my Oura Ring, phones, watches, household smart devices. Really interested then in just how data could solve problems in general. And I think that then became kind of the heart of my passion for it. But yeah, that's kind of how I got into data and data science. Then I've worked in big companies since then, where I stayed for a while, and then consulting afterwards, and then a mix now, being greedy.
Amazing. Do you know what? It is so purpose driven, isn't it? It can be data. And as we know, there's data for good, data for bad. And I'm particularly interested in those areas. And healthcare very much lends itself to that.
Definitely.
What changes have you seen within the healthcare sphere, within machine learning, AI, in your time in the industry?
Yeah, I think there's a movement towards prevention, which is a big one. So I guess trying to understand the factors that might go into illness in healthcare in different ways. And, trying to build models that are predictive and then giving us that kind of, I suppose, shot beforehand of maybe putting an intervention in place, changing the outcomes, getting involved in that. So that's definitely really huge. And I can definitely see the world of large language models, clinical assistants, those sorts of things only making that even more interesting.
Yeah.
I also think alongside healthcare, there's a good space for this in education. I've also done quite a bit of work with NHS England on their education side, so clinical educators. And there's a real appetite and desire to kind of apply those learnings from other industries, because other industries are quite far ahead of healthcare and education for good reason, because they've got deeper effects in some cases. But there's a lot of learning that can be done. There's a lot of passion. There's a lot of desire to do it and just do things differently. And I think data science is such a great tool to do that.
Yeah, 100%. And consultancy then in particular, how did you get into that? Was that a considered decision, or was that?
It was a funny one because I worked at a company called Orca for 6 years. It was my first real job out of uni, I suppose. And I've always been grateful for my work there because I joined when it was really small. And there was only 10 of us, or 10 to 15 of us, I think, when I started. And obviously a lot of companies like that, it's chaos. But one of the really lovely things about startups at that stage is everybody can get involved in a bit of everything. And I really loved that, and kind of being there at the point where you're going, how are we going to do this? How do we figure this out? Who are we as a company? And I think I stayed there for a long time. Eventually was the head of data. I joined as a digital health analyst at the time, and then a data scientist, and then head of data, where I had some direct reports, which was good fun. But the company reached a good point. I think it was about 150 of us at that point, where I felt like I kind of wanted to dip back into the chaos a little bit. Not because I didn't like what the company was doing, but just because I realized that I found that I kind of thrived in that environment. I enjoyed building things up from scratch like that. And I kind of saw consultancy as a way to have a go at it. And I'd thought about it for a little while, and I was really lucky that I'd met some people at Orca that kind of introduced me to some work that was going on at NHS England. And they were kind of saying, look, if you join part of the agency we're working with, you can get involved and do the contracting work. And it was a 2-year contract, which is very lucky. And I feel very lucky because I know it's not like that in consulting a lot, but it gave me that kind of safety net to go, well, I've got 2 years worth. If it doesn't work, maybe I can do something else. But yeah, that kind of gave me the push to do it.
Yeah. And then a few months ago, you joined Anamana. So you're back
indeed.
into chaos, maybe beautiful chaos there, a bit more ordered and structured, I imagine, because of Hemant.
Definitely. And I think what I realized, and I know we've talked about this before, is contracting's great, and you get to meet a lot of different people and you get to expand your network. And I think from a data science perspective, one of the things that affected me probably a little bit more than I thought was it's probably a blunt way to put it, but there's a loneliness side to it.
Yeah.
I loved the ability to work from home, especially as a new dad. I can spend a lot of time with my family, but it does blur the lines between work and home quite a lot. And also, especially when you're doing coding work, although you interface with people, there's a lot of periods where you're just kind of in the dungeon the data dungeon late at night doing code. And that's great because I enjoy the code and I enjoy kind of getting stuck in like that. But after a while, I kind of felt like it would be good to be part of a mission again. And when we spoke and I heard about Anamana and I was looking at what they do, I just loved the purpose-driven side of the way that the business is built. And when I met Hemant and Ben as well, that really clicked for us together. And it just felt like such a natural fit. I wasn't sure that they would go for, because they were looking for a full-time job, but I wasn't sure they would go for kind of doing it half and half, but they were really game to experiment. So now I've kind of I'm being greedy. There's kind of this half and half thing going on, and it's chaos, which seems that word's coming up a lot, probably me in a nutshell. But good chaos. Like I get to be part of that mission at Anamana, and I can still pursue those interests of mine as well, and lots of those cross over as well. So
yeah, of course. The experience you gain in both spaces lend themselves to each other as well, don't they?
Definitely.
So at Anamana, you're heading up machine learning and AI initiatives.
I am. I think the title that we settled on was lead AI specialist, which sounds very jazzy and has afforded me lots of targeting on LinkedIn. Is probably the right way to explain that in a good way, because I think people want to speak to those kinds of people. But yeah, my role at Anamana is an interesting one because I look after the data science side of things, but I'm also really into the strategy side.
Yeah.
So when we're working with new companies, it's looking at, is there genuinely a use case for AI and data science here? Is it really throwing agents at it just because we can? Or is it something a bit more subtle? Is it a bit more analytical? It's something that they need, that's not in that sphere just yet. It might be, but for now, they just need to get the reporting right. And what does that look like? And how are people using data in the business? So another thing I've focused on quite a lot is, I suppose, culture around data and AI, and how bringing in those technologies and changes can kind of affect the way that people work, because it does make a huge difference. If you've got something that's augmenting your job and you've got all this free time, what do you do with that free time? Are you just putting in more output, or does it give you more time to kind of play and be curious?
Yeah. And being in a data consultancy, you do get an overview of lots of different businesses, what's working, what's not working.
Definitely.
We'll start with the positives. So implementing data initiatives, data culture, data strategy, what do you need to get right? And if you get that right, what can that enable?
Yeah, I think there's two things. I think it's a two-way street. I think there's a responsibility on the people in the company. So there has to be a desire to want to use data. And I'll come back to that in a second, because that can be teased out in a couple of different ways by the business. And then there's a business responsibility to commit to using data, being transparent with it, and actually wanting to use the outputs. A lot of people say that data, it can be. Obviously, it can't be, but it's the study of truth. And in businesses, I think that's an important note to make, because I see it as about living in reality. So it's about, where are we actually? Not vanity metrics that say, we're doing well on these things, but the business isn't actually going anywhere. It's kind of being brutally honest about, where are we not going well? Okay, we've changed this feature in the product and our customer base has dipped. That's something we need to change. And I think having that approach allows you to be quite agile and fail fast. And you can do a lot of quite quick testings, initiatives in some companies, where you can see the results and you can see the outputs and you can say, look, we've made these changes. They do make a difference. Let's keep going. Let's push it forward. But when I say coming back to the people side, there's a responsibility to encourage people. It's kind of linked to the business side, but knowing that the data is accurate, that they will be listened to. It's not just that they're going to pull data together, have a conversation about it, and management goes, well, my gut feel is X, so we're not going to listen to that. There has to be a real want to do it and a desire to listen. What
are the motivations behind? Because some of the motivations can be the right motivations and some may be the wrong, because they think, well, everyone else is data-driven. They're saying they're data-driven in their mission statements now. Yeah. So we should get on board with that. So what are the right motivations to want to go on this journey? Because it is a long-term commitment. It's not a program of works and then it suddenly ends. No. Like you said, it's a cultural shift.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that's got to be embedded into the company. And I think a lot of people would claim to be data-driven in the sense that they might use data, or their product might have I think a lot of people conflate it with having a data science or an artificial intelligence service. And they say, well, we do that, so we're data-driven. No, for me, data-driven is about setting up that culture of data excellence. And I think there's some really easy steps that you can take towards doing that. A popular one that I use is, I'll go into three parts of it. There's kind of like a data profile where you can kind of say, and I think this is key for the people in helping them engage with the company and wanting to get involved in the data. And they sound like really boring names. I think someone needs to reinvent them a little bit. But and people have heard these, I think. They're not buzzwordy, but people have probably heard them before, is data dictionaries. It sounds boring, but having a unified language around the way that you talk about data in the business is so important. I've been into loads of companies where marketing, sales, and devs, all think that active users are different things. So when you have conversations about that, it's not as helpful as you might think. The other part of that is, I suppose, having, again, horrible name, but it's what it's commonly called. I need to come up with a better name for it, but data asset registry. So what data have we got? Where does it live? Who looks after it? How do I get access to it? You know, if you're in a non-data team in the company and you need access to information, where do you go to get it? It's not just always into the data team. There might be resources you can use, but you can access it yourself. And the last side is kind of like a reporting log. Again, bad name. But this idea of, you know, what reports already exist? Am I asking for information that is already being given to someone somewhere and I just need to know about that? I think even just those three things are just foundational to a company being able to go, actually, yeah, I do understand the data we have in this company. And talking to the data team, again, I think is another skill in itself, because with data literacy, I don't think you're trying to turn people into analysts. You've got a team for that. You're trying to expose people to the data and how to get it in the correct way, I think.
So in your discovery calls or meetings with potential new clients, do you go through those 3 steps with them?
If that's something that they want to do, and it has to be something they want to do, if they want to embed a data culture, and I would always say, why wouldn't you? Because of the benefits we talked about before, then that's a piece of work that I'd normally set up with them, and I'd say it's not hard to pull together. I can talk to a few different people, we'll get this, we'll put it central where people can have a look at it.
Do you get dumbfounded expressions when people have gone, we're so data driven, and then you ask them that and they're like, excuse me, what are you talking about?
A little bit. I think, like I say, because people see it in a different way. And I think in particular, I think social media and the wider conversations that happen on platforms like LinkedIn aren't helpful for that. Because I think people hear data driven and, like I say, they think, oh, I do data science, so I'm data driven. And it's not that. It's about using data to make effective decisions. And that's a lot harder than it sounds like.
Yeah, no, of course. So the bad side, so if you are trying to commit to data strategy, what's the negative impact if it goes wrong, would you say, and what have you seen?
I've seen a couple of times companies develop into this kind of blame space where I think people mistake the desire to be transparent as the ability to criticize. So where they want to go in and say, actually, I now have data that you're not performing your function. Whereas really it's about the function's not performing. How do we change that? What can we do about it? And I think I try and, I guess, bring that culture in the way that I work with them. And so does Anamana, actually, in the work that we do. It's a big, important part of the work that we do. But from a negative side, like you say, I have seen a few times where I've kind of worked with a company and maybe come back and I've kind of seen the development of that kind of data strategy. And that employees are saying to me that, I'm now being called out in meetings because my numbers are X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, well, that's not on you. That's a conversation with the wider team about what those numbers actually mean and what we're going to do about it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, actually. So do you think, and that's been repercussions that have happened, but do you think some companies or individuals are scared of what the numbers will reveal
100%.
as well, like kind of hiding behind the bad data?
No, 100%. And I think there is wider context in that. Look, businesses often have investors and a board that they rely on. They've got customers that they rely on. They don't want to be putting out public data on things that might not be going well. Although I would challenge companies to do that, because more and more so people are interested in transparency and wanting to see companies for who they are. And I think companies that are transparent about shortcomings maybe and where they want to grow and where they've got it wrong, I think they'll do well, because I think there's a culture of people that have grown up wanting that environment.
Yeah, interesting point. My coach, Mark Nealon, actually said to me, what you can measure, you can improve.
Absolutely.
And that's always stuck with me. Okay, maybe it's not great, but now we know we're not just going to hide behind. And because if you don't try and do anything about it, naturally the patterns will reoccur.
Absolutely.
But if you know, it's like, right, okay, what action are we going to take now?
Yeah. And there's I was going to say, there's a great piece of work I've been inspired by quite a lot is Dr. Lorian Pratt. She's got a great book called Link, which is all about using data in decision making. So it's about chaining those objectives to actions to outcomes. Or we're using objectives. I'm going to butcher this now. She's going to never want to speak to me ever again. But it's objectives using data to get an outcome or an action.
Yeah.
And there's a brilliant piece of work there around how you can use data to make decisions and ask the right questions. And I think there's a lot of buzzwords in the AI space. And as you'll know, I'm a big fan of the decision intelligence side of stuff.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And you did a talk at Let's Talk Data and Decision Intelligence, which the audience were very engaged with. And now you have a fan base
I don't know about that.
What is the difference then between data science, I suppose, and decision intelligence? And I know there's different explanations for what it is, but how would you describe it and the difference?
I think they're linked. I think data science forms a part of the decision intelligence model. So decision intelligence for me, and this is my definition of it, is it's kind of the study of the decision-making process. And it's about being involved in using data science, analytics, simulation in some cases, to model the effects of decisions that you might want to take. So I think with the kind of explosion of data that everybody talks about, and it's very true, and the amount of information that's available, lots of companies are sitting on, really interesting historical data about what happened. They've got data scientists that have the skill to look at what might happen, so do some forecasting or some predictive analytics, even simulation, where they can kind of say, look, we think we want to make this decision, and that bit at the front, what decision to make, is much harder than it sounds, and asking the right question, that's a whole thing. Using that information then you've got the constraints, I suppose. So, okay, we want to make a decision. What are we limited by? Money, resources, typical things, but also limitations of the product, for example. You've then got historical data. So for a company, it might be historical performance. You've then got that predictive part, you've got the simulation part. And I think together you've got this really robust framework where you can kind of say, look, with as much information as possible, I have almost everything, all the intelligence I could want to try and make the best decision. And then obviously after that, you've got the post decision. What happened? How do we measure the effect of the decision? How do we evaluate that? How do we take the learnings back into that process and try again?
Yeah.
That to me is decision intelligence. So
what is a user case for decision intelligence then that you've seen?
I think a great way to look at it would be, there's a few. I think it might be, hypothetical one might be companies trying to decide what kind of new feature they wanted to bring into a product. And they might have historical information about customer views, customer feedback, all kinds of bits like that. They might have data scientists that can look at, the usage on the platform, given that feedback, and what the expected, outcomes of changing that feature might be in each case or multiple cases. And then kind of taking that decision, doing the build, bringing that fail fast bit, where you could maybe build like a prototype or an MVP, ship that out to a choice group of users, kind of get some immediate feedback, evaluate your decision, come back and loop again. Probably something like that. Okay.
And what particular frameworks, models, platforms can you recommend to embed decision intelligence?
Dr. Lorian Pratt's process. She's got causal decision diagrams, which is a great way to do that. So that's the reason I love that is because it's visual. So it kind of gets everything on she kind of calls it a decision space. And you can kind of look at those decisions up front, see how they link to data, see how they link to different actions and different outcomes. It's a very visual way to do it. That's a great thing to do. Purely from a tool perspective, biased, but Python from a data science perspective obviously opens up multiple possibilities to do this. Reporting platforms to kind of look at those outcomes, your classic Power BIs, Tableaus, that sort of stuff. But fairly typical stack. I think one of the barriers and bottlenecks to something like that is your data environment, which is something we look at quite a lot in Anamana, is do you have this kind of disparate set of data that doesn't talk to each other? Or do you kind of have this unified view, which, I think is a movement in the industry in general, which is more useful in those sorts of conversations.
Okay. So what stage of data strategy, because I know some are very much in the infancy, others are more mature, would you start to look at decision intelligence then?
I think there's an argument that you should be looking to build in that way from the start.
Yeah.
And
start as you mean to go on.
Exactly. And I think for new companies, it's not that there's no excuse, because companies change, the data they collect changes. Like I've said before, companies should be aware enough of what's going on with their business that they can pivot and be agile. So naturally, that means that new data might come in, new data feeds, etc. I think if you can build that way, that's great. If you can't, I think there has to be some dedication to exploring your architecture, exploring your data environment, even partnering someone with like Anamana or equivalent to maybe do that and look at how you could kind of bring that together to serve the purpose. But I guess this all comes back to that data-driven culture piece around if you want to genuinely use data to make decisions, that decision intelligence approach is there.
Yeah, 100%. So I want to look at disinformation and the era of that, or the age of that, as you so eloquently put, outside, because the interesting thing about data and AI, it's not just a work thing, it's the world we live in now, and social media and the algorithms. And actually, Geoffrey Hinton was on the Diary of the CEO, the godfather of AI. And there's so many things that struck me about that conversation. But one thing is the silos we now live in, because before you'd get quite I suppose, broad overview of what was going on in the news. But now, some people think it's very handy that things are tailored. Like, oh my gosh, I've just been searching this and now my algorithms are all about this.
Yeah.
But it makes your world and the opinions in that world so small, and it's pretty dangerous. And with that, it's not always correct. I hear so many people talk about things. I'm like, did you read the article? Did you watch the video? Or have you just seen one clickbait headline that you now are referring to and spreading?
100%. And I think there's an element of critical thinking that I think people don't appreciate goes with some of the information that you see online. I think people have always been aware that obviously people can put things on the internet that aren't true. And I think, like you said, when the internet was maybe a little bit more grouped into these platforms, especially the social media channels and news outlets, I think it might have been a little bit easier to kind of fish some of that out. But like you say, some people have used these platforms for years and they're almost built into their own shout chambers where they're being targeted in some instances with certain types of information. And the people that they're communicating with on that platform are also being targeted with that information. So when you're looking to validate, is this information correct, or does that image look right, or is that video actually accurate, you're around people that maybe don't collectively, you're not looking for those issues in the information.
Because we all want to know we're right.
100%.
So it's kind of like, you saw that right, so that must be right, because you saw it and I saw it and we all saw it. It's scary. And
it's hard not to know what's true. I mean, everyone will have been seeing, all sorts of amazing creations and videos coming out of things like ChatGPT, Claude, large language models. And the scary thing is that I've seen, my dad, interestingly, he has like an app that he was putting our pictures into, and it was kind of styling you in some different time periods, which was a really fun thing to do. Although I did have some words with him about where that data was going, especially with given it's pictures of yourself. But the images that come back, it's harder and harder to go, actually, that you could post that and that could be real. There's some really obvious things, like I'm sure people have seen the funny ones where people have got 6 fingers or something like that. But the more data that those models are exposed to, the more that they're learning, the better that they get. And that's, I think, one of the interesting things about the internet in general is, it's obvious now to me, and kind of like this position in my career, that any site or platform that's offering a free service is there to harvest information and to do with that information what they will. And you could argue that ChatGPT and other equivalents are one giant training experiment for large language models, to help them not just be trained on this giant corpus of information from the internet, but to have real conversations with people. I had a scary one in one of the companies I worked with previously, where it was a mental health company that was looking at avatars, digital avatars for mental health in young people. And you have a skepticism going into it that, a large language model could never have that kind of conversation with a person. But you see the outputs and look at what we built in the company. And I've been genuinely moved a little bit by some of the conversations that you can have. And that's scary, because when you can feel, when something like that can make you feel something, it's real because you're experiencing it, right?
Yeah. And Geoffrey Hinton, what he talks about, and I suppose the fact is the acceleration of innovation is probably what none of us could predict. And certainly he didn't predict decades ago. But now we're in a position where it's not just companies competing, it's countries competing. And
Absolutely.
those countries have different regulations, different policy, different outlook. That's when it becomes worrying. And, we've always had innovation in technology where legislation has struggled to keep up.
Yes.
But I think now we're really at a period where, even the words regulation, policy, governance is do we really need it? But we do need it.
We do.
And governments, companies, individuals need to take responsibility. What do you think can be done?
It's such a huge question. And I think it's a unified approach. I appreciate the EU legislation that's just come in. So there's the AI Regulation Act that's come in to limit the harm that I guess certain types of AI can do. And if they are AI models that have the ability to, in areas like health law, etc., there should be stringent measures in place to check that. I mean, a huge one is that the data sets themselves aren't biased towards the people that they're serving.
Of course.
That's a huge issue in data in general, is that you've got data sets from populations that ultimately don't match the people that they serve. I mean, the old classic example of that was, I don't know if you've ever seen it online, there's the one with the tanks. Where and this is me in my shout chamber because I've seen it a couple of times.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we've got different ones.
But the story there is that they built a classifier for tanks, and I believe I'm going to get this wrong now. I believe it was. I feel like I wanted to say it was in Russia, but I know it was in a cold country because there was lots of snow in the background, and the model. They were like, oh, this model's got 99% accuracy. It's great. But it was because it was picking up the snow in the background in every single picture. And not the best example, but my point being is that there's an element of reproducibility and checking that the model actually serves the people that's intended to serve. If you're building a women's fitness app and you're trying to use data that's, from a predominantly male data set, it's not going to work.
No.
You have to involve the actual women that you're planning to collaborate with and use with this product to actually see what the right data should be.
Yeah, and that's a good point because there is a bias. There is 100%. A data gap, and we know that a lot of
especially
medicine was tested on males, not females. So there isn't that data.
No.
So it's really difficult. And still we're in a period where lots of different, I suppose, underrepresented groups maybe haven't even, and not necessarily in the UK, but other countries, they're not actually, birth certificates don't exist for some tribes or whatever it is.
Sure.
So it's the data is biased. So then the AI naturally is going to become biased, and the large language models will as well.
Yeah.
Do you think there's an awareness of this, and as much as an awareness as there should be?
I think there is. I think there's a desire in the data science community, and I genuinely believe this, to build things that work.
Yeah.
And by work, I mean serve the people well in the way that it's supposed to. I think there's a pressure, though, that comes alongside that, and especially in data science companies, to build something that is accurate. And sometimes the purpose can come at the cost of trying to get a really accurate model. Things like the EU AI Act are great because they mandate companies that are in that high-risk company to have those checks and always have that independent validation. But, there are lots of the open source nature of data science and data in general is fantastic. There's a wealth, an absolute wealth of information online in the industry. However, that means that people that maybe don't traditionally come from a data science background can use now tools like ChatGPT to build code really easily. And that's great because you want people to explore, you want people to get interested in the topic, but they might not have that rigor in there, and I think there is an influx of data scientists that are coming into the industry that maybe don't come from that background, and they're coming from maybe a background where it's almost like a vibe coding area where they're building in tandem with ChatGPT and they have some ability to critique it, but they don't really understand what's going on under the hood.
Yeah, that is dangerous because there is Geoffrey Hinton and talks about the jobless society that we may well live in. And coding is one of them, and that wasn't a job that necessarily a couple of years ago we were like, they'll be gone. It was more like administrative roles and whatnot. But like you said, you might be able to do it, but do you get it? it's very obvious when someone uses a word that they don't really understand, but ChatGPT's come up with that word and they're like, that sounds good, I'll use that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But like critically thinking, you can think, I've never heard you use that word before. That's so obvious. And the way even they construct sentences is like, that is not you. So it's obvious to someone else, but to them, they might be like, oh, I'm onto something here.
Well, you can see it. I mean, I feel like, maybe I don't, but I feel like I have a fairly good nose for it sometimes on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is one of the worst places for this, where you just see endless posts. Because I'm in the data science and AI space, they are around that topic, but they're clearly a prompt that's come out with a load of language, and it's this huge like paragraph of stuff that doesn't really go anywhere. It doesn't feel like it's there to get engagement.
There's no soul.
And exactly. And I know that you can argue that maybe LinkedIn's not the best place to appraise that, given what the platform's for, but it'd probably get harder and harder to tell.
I can see. I mean, I get so frustrated when everyone I get the same cover letter every day now. And I'm like, where's normal language gone? Like it's too formal.
Yeah.
And I don't think that doesn't stand out, certainly not in the world we operate. And I'll be really honest, I delete those emails because I'm like, you can't be bothered. And I use it, but I put my text in and then say, refine this or make it sound better if I'm struggling with some of the constructs.
Yeah.
But can you write a cover letter for me for this job? Go. Well, I mean, it's very obvious when the prompt is poor.
Well, it comes
or lazy.
Definitely, and it comes back to my view of I'm a massive believer that these tools are for augmentation. There are things that ultimately AI and machines can do better. Heavily repetitive tasks that people may not want to do themselves anyway. Our prime targets for things like generative AI and agents and stuff like that. But for a lot of jobs, I see it as almost like a digital assistant. It's there to augment your capability and make you smarter, ultimately, to work together. That's my optimistic look for what I hope will come. And I am
in the machine, hand in hand,
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Jeffrey thinks everyone should become a plumber.
Do you know what? He's not wrong, because it's going to be a while before the robotic side, I think, catches up with the digital side.
Of course.
Although that being said, there's, particularly with agents at the minute, where you've got, not just AI that can, have a conversation, it can take action, and one of those actions might be activate this robot in this warehouse to do this function. I think plumbing's probably safe for a while because it's nuanced, but, long term, yeah, it can be scary to think about.
Yeah, it can be. We don't need to think that far into the future.
No.
I really like that you pointed out critical thinking, especially around disinformation, because I've been guilty of it. I'll read something like, oh my God, did you hear this? And then, you can see how it can spread and the dangers of that. So I want to talk about different skill sets. So those out of the data space, for example, when you're, engaging with maybe data or just stories or information, what skills do you think you need alongside critical thinking to maybe just be careful and understand it before you spread it?
I think there's a curiosity side to it. There has to be, I think it's easy now to just read a lot of things and take them at face value. And I think you can actually use large language models to do this, where you can take like a piece of context that you've seen or a piece of content that you've seen, and you can put it into ChatGPT and say, where's the evidence for this? Where are the sources? Where might this have come from? You can get it to give you a fairly succinct summary of a piece of information and where it's come from. I think it's awareness and the curiosity side, in the sense that, it, alongside the critical thinking of, hold on, does this sound right? And is this really true? The curiosity of, well, I'm going to go and explore and have a look myself so that I'm actually informed on the topic rather than just taking it at face value. And then an awareness piece, knowing that I think we're living in a world where people are unknowingly already interacting with lots of AI agents and automations, and it's being aware of that fact and going, okay, at the moment, AI and agents do hallucinate and they do say things that might not be true, or they might not have the full context. I'm aware of that. Therefore, when I see this piece of information, I suspect it might be from that kind of system, I can double check it.
Yeah. I think a greater piece around that as well is like, we all live in autopilot, don't we? So it's that time to write, okay, I'll look at that, I'll reflect, I'll think about that, I might deep dive into it. And then, but at the moment it's like story. And it's that our brains, and I don't actually have TikTok, it overwhelms me. I tried to put some videos up for Let's Talk Data and I was like, why are these videos coming at me? And I must say, one thing I've really, I'm like conscious of, like, I'll sit down and watch a YouTube 2 hours, like the Diary of the CEO the other day. I watched it Tuesday night, whatever it was. And I do have that attention span because I'm very conscious that you can lose it. And I'm trying to purposely keep on to it. I'm not saying I'm perfect with it and I can get very distracted, but I do think a lot of people consume so much information in one day and their brains are like confusing it. And like you said, it is just taking a step back. Okay, I'm interested in that. Let me look into it a little bit more and reflect on it.
Well, it's huge dopamine hits that are coming from these kind of technologies. And I think one of the scary things is, and I can't remember the name of the TED Talk that I watched, I want to say Johan. He wrote a great book, I think, or I get into people mixed up, but it was called Stolen Focus. And it was talking about how, how obsessed with these tools we are, and then the why, the dopamine hit that you're getting from these kind of products. It's all novel. You're seeing things video to video that you've never seen before. They're interesting or they're funny, and you're constantly then going like, well, what's the next one? What's the next one? What's the next one? And I think with that, it can be hard to kind of break free from it and take a step back.
Yeah, because it's addictive.
It's addictive. And I think the scary part is it's built like that. There was a lot of work done, pre-2000s about attention and how to capture people's attention and how to keep people using products, because for some of those bigger platforms like social media platforms, the currency for them is your attention. So they are developing, you're in an antagonistic relationship with these companies that are trying to farm your attention. And I don't know if a lot of people are aware of the sort of power that companies are putting into tools that do that. Absolutely. And you can only imagine with large language models, I know we were talking about the good and the bad before, that having that human side of it, or apparently human side of it, can only make things sometimes worse.
Yeah. And I suppose this isn't new in the sense that from a media perspective, if we start with the news, you'll hear journalists talking about the fact that they started talking about something very purpose-driven that they were interested in, wanting to change the world in whatever capacity. And then, their editor would be like, well, that's not going to sell stories.
Yeah, so let's take the sound bites.
Yeah. And some really stick true to it. And I read on LinkedIn as well, actually, interestingly, about the dopamine. And I suppose you put something out there. What is the reason? Are you trying to spread awareness, trying to build community, get business? But at the end of the day, most people just want likes and shares, because that, is an ego thing. It probably gives us a dopamine hit. But really, we're putting things out there for the wrong reason.
Yeah, and it's the currency of those platforms. They want you to do that because, it ultimately comes back to having people's attention and putting ads on some of those platforms so that, that they can get their revenue on that side of things. I know I've got a very cynical look on this, but I think it's because when you're under the hood and from a data science perspective, the power of these tools.
Yeah.
The realization that some of those tools have been built for the purpose of essentially drawing you into an app to look at videos for 2 hours when you could have been doing something else. You could have been with family, with friends, doing something else. I'm not saying it's all bad, by the way. I think those platforms are also great for, like you said, curating content that you're interested in. But there is a line.
Yeah.
You were talking about TikTok. I found that with TikTok is that I initially I went into it like, I'm not going to get addicted to this. Everyone was like, don't use it. And I was like, well, I want to have a look at it. And it seems interesting. And initially I was like, oh, there's some great data science videos. There's great videos on the gym because I was going to the gym at the time, looking at how you can do different exercises. But it slowly got polluted by what I find funny, news clips, all sorts of stuff like that, until I realized, and I deleted it eventually, that everything that I was seeing was, and I'd lose like an hour into like just all of the short form video and be like, what was I just doing? I wanted to go for lunch, not watch like an hour of TikTok.
Yeah, it's no accident. It's the same as the ultra processed food industry. I was reading about that, and the fact that Pringles, you eat them and you can't stop. That's not an accident. They're actually A/B testing flavors to see how many you have and in what time period you have them, and they'll go with the flavor where the chances are you're going to finish the whole pot or whatever.
I'd like to be in that experiment. I love a Pringle. And I could probably.
Well, that's no accident.
I know. I've been.
No one binges on strawberries or blueberries, and there's probably a reason for that. So it's of the same ilk, I suppose. So within the data science world, then, because I see this engaging with candidates, and I know who gets ahead, I know who gets interviews, who does well in interview, and there's all different types of personality, and that's amazing, and we love diversity.
Of course.
But there are certain skills, especially with data science, if you can't explain what you're doing to a non-technical audience, it's really going to stifle your career. So what have you seen, and what are the core skills aside from the technical do you think data scientists need?
I think you hit the nail on the head. I think that's the biggest one, is being able to have non-technical conversations with non-technical people in the business. And I have experience of this. In my first company, the company I mentioned before that was at for a while, Orca, when I first started, I got really frustrated. I was building all these reports and I was handing off all these numbers and I was building these models and I was like, look, here's all this information. Why aren't you doing anything about it? And it's not that they didn't care. It's that I was so obsessed with the process of building and looking at the data that I wasn't really taking into account these are just numbers. They're not driving decisions. They're not, the leadership team can't take this and go, well, let's make a difference and do something about it. And when I changed that, I saw massive improvements in the engagement with the management team there, with even the individual teams and their want to get involved with data, because it's then purpose-led and it's not just, here's a nice number. And then I dug into the, what's making this business tick and trying to get metrics around that. And then that opens up those conversations then again around, where do we go from here? It's purpose driven. So that ability to communicate with non-technical audiences, 100%. And it's hard from a data science perspective, because I know that sometimes it can feel a little bit thankless, especially if you're building kind of like a data science model. It's not the effort that goes into the model and the technical brilliance behind the scenes that often gets the reward. Even though you're obviously building in that space, it's the, well, what did this do bit, which sometimes can get handled by non-data scientists. But alongside that, the other thing is business understanding. And I'm trying to link those two together, because I know a lot of people that are technically far greater than I will ever be from a data science perspective. And I've mentored a few people like this. And they can't see outside of the model work that they're building. They don't understand wider than what they're building, how the actual business works. And what I mean by that is they don't realize where what they're building is going to go and what impact it's going to have and how they're going to measure it. They're just thinking about the technical side of the model. And those skills are needed, because obviously you need those people that can build, in a lot of cases, those heavier duty modeling capacities and even AI products. But if it's not built in the context of how the business is set up, you'll never have that true business understanding about what you're building. Yeah,
agreed. So the example you gave before, where you realised that the business weren't engaging with what you'd brought to them, did someone give you that feedback, or was it a realisation for you, like, okay, I need to change?
It was both. I think it was an offhand comment. Like, I think I'd gone to a meeting and I think they could tell that I was annoyed, and I think I wasn't being very subtle about it.
You're like, I've put so much work into this.
Yeah, and I think they could sense my frustration, because I think this was maybe the second or third, probably third, like iteration that I'd done, and in my head I was like, well, I built it to your spec. This is what you wanted, and this is what I think needs to be in here. But until I kind of had, I can't remember what the offhand comment was, but I'm sure it was something like, but how does that relate to the business? And it was like a penny drop. And I was like, actually, yeah, it's great knowing like that number, but what's driving that? What's underneath? How is that moving the dial? And I had that self-awareness moment then of like, like, I don't understand how these data points fit into the wider purpose of the business. I am in this box. I need to get out of the box and, speak to people in the business, understand how it works, put something a bit more purpose-driven together.
I mean, that's amazing that you have that experience firsthand. So when you're mentoring and coaching more junior team members, do you get this across that this is key? You need to nail this skill?
I think for me, I always encourage people in the companies that they're working in, I encourage them to take time to speak to each individual team, understand their needs, understand what they're struggling with. That's another thing that's probably a different topic, but, there's how data teams operate, and I've seen a lot of data teams simply become ticket vendors where they sit there and they get requests from multiple teams, often the same requests all the time, and that's it. That's all they do. They're not strategic partners. They're not able to be curious. But I think I always say to the people I mentor, if you take the effort to understand the business, get to know the people in the department, who wants data, what data do they want, what do they want it for, how does it link to the wider goals of the business, you almost build up this like company formula of like, okay, how are we making money? How are we functioning as a company? How are we serving our ultimate objectives of being, X biggest company in this space? You can pull all that together from having those conversations. And it's not being afraid to ask the executive team about those things as well. What do they want from the information? What visibility do they have over the performance of the company internally and externally? You'd think it would be a lot, but in a lot of companies, they're kind of flying blind.
Yeah. And you'll naturally get more satisfaction and less
100%.
Frustration when people are like, yeah, I get what you're doing and why you're doing it. Thank you.
100%.
Thank you.
and you can present it in the context of, I've built this model because I know you're struggling with this challenge, and that challenge was X, and I've built this model that does Y, and it tells you Z. And then you've got a productive conversation about, oh yeah, I understand that. It's in my language. It's in my sphere. Let's partner and do something about it.
Yeah, sounds perfect. We're going to move on to the quick fire data lightning round.
Okay, exciting.
What's a common misconception in data that you'd like to debunk?
I don't know. There's so many. What's a common misconception in data that I'd like to debunk? We all use spreadsheets all the time. That one.
You don't?
Every now and again, more of my work's been in Python, but I can't lie that I still end up in Excel. I've done myself in there.
Step away from Excel. Name a book, event, or podcast that every data enthusiast should explore.
Book-wise, the one I mentioned before, Dr. Lorian Pratt Link. I think that's an amazing book. I would recommend that to any data scientist.
Yeah, I'll read that. Finish this sentence. Data is the key to.
Data is the key to reality.
It is. Unearthing the truth, you said before.
That's the one.
That was fantastic. One piece of advice you'd give to someone entering the world of data.
Be aware that it's not just about the models. And I know online it can be very intimidating, and that you should know the statistics and the maths behind how the models work. But a lot of what you do in the data science world ultimately doesn't come down to that.
Yeah, like what we said before. Name a data buzzword that you love to hate.
Love to hate.
There's a few.
There is a few. There is a few.
You can have a few.
Can I? I was going to say AI in itself. I feel like everybody's just using AI for anything that looks remotely data-driven now.
Yeah.
If it's anything that involves data, it's like, it's AI.
Did you see that lady? I think she was a governor of education, maybe not in America, and she was calling it A1. And she's supposed to, they were having a conversation and she kept referring to it as A1. But yeah, AI, everyone thinks they know exactly what AI means.
Yeah, and I think it's just used in everything. And I feel like companies feel this pressure to go like, we're AI driven. We build AI projects, build AI products. And under the hood, they just don't.
No. Well, we'll have that one. Seems very apt.
I'll take that.
Well done. There we go.